Excellent. Well, we'll kick off. It's 11 o'clock. So welcome everybody to our fifth session of our Leading and Learning series, which runs through to June 2025. Before we start, we respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet, work and live, and we recognise the enduring spiritual connection and honour the sacredness of the land. We pay our respects to elders past and present and the future, and the deep-seated wisdom that they hold, and we solemnly remind ourselves that this land has been and always will be Aboriginal land. So I'm Louise from the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation, working as part of the Drought Ready team. And this network is proudly sponsored by or supported by the Future Drought Fund's helping regional communities prepare for drought initiative, which is all about strengthening resilience across our regions. And I just want to give a shout out to our Northern Queensland, Townsville regions. They're going to need a lot of resilience as they get through their current weather pattern. But thank you all for joining us today. I am really excited about this session, Windows and Back Loops, creating and taking opportunities for change with Paul Ryan. So this session will be interactive with breakout rooms and opportunities for QA throughout. So please feel free to use those tools or the chat for questions as well. We'll keep an eye on it. We would love to see your faces, so please keep your cameras on if you're comfortable. While we're recording the session, only Paul's face will be spotlighted, which is a wonderful face as well, Paul. But now to introduce Paul. Paul is not only one of our fantastic Changemaker workshop facilitators, but also an ARLF associate and the founding director of the Australian Resilience Centre. He's a global leader in resilience, adaptation and transformation practice, and we're lucky to have him with us today. Over the past year, ARLF has had the privilege of delivering more than over 60 Changemaker workshops across the country. And time again, one conversation keeps coming up that reflects communities are transitioning. The way things have always been done are being challenged, and people are asking, what's next? How do we adapt? Who will step up? And these are big questions, and they matter because they shape our future of our communities, but they also create exciting opportunities. So Paul will introduce the adaptive cycle, a powerful model that explains how communities, businesses, institutions, and even ecosystems evolve over time. And he will also help us explore why and how change happens, and most importantly, how we can anticipate and respond to it. So Paul, thank you very much. Paul's just returning from some holidays, so his first gig for kicking off 2025. So thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Louise. Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity. And yeah, first gig back for after 2 months, so I'm a bit rusty, everyone. So just bear with me. Yeah, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country that I'm on here too in northeast Victoria. I live in Beechworth, which is shared country between the plains and the hills, and yeah, just acknowledge the long and enduring connection that First Nations people have here to the country that I'm on. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I'm really excited to be here. I love talking about the stuff I'm going to talk about, the adaptive cycle and about change. And as Louise said, I've had the privilege of working with the foundation for a while and having the opportunity to go all around the country and deliver Changemaker workshops, but also just in our other work around transition and change and resilience. And this idea, this concept that I'm going to talk about has been one of the most powerful tools that we've used again and again, and it helps to just create insights and create opportunities for people to think about where am I at, where are we at as a community or an organisation or an industry, and what might be coming next, and what are importantly, what are the mindsets and behaviours that we need as we move through these different changes. So, you know, we've found this a really useful tool again and again and again. And so I'm just going to share, I guess, the greatest hits, if you like, about this kind of model. There's lots more to it. There's lots of stuff you can read. It's been around for a long time, and I'll talk a little bit about its origin. And I'd encourage you, if it sparks your interest, is to just get online and Google. Lots of organisations have picked it up in the last few years, and starting to use it in their planning and their thinking, that sort of stuff. Just quickly, so a little bit about my background. So I grew up on a farm between Shep and Echuca, Shepparton and Echuca in northern Victoria, close to the Goulburn River. Family have been farming there for a long time. We've actually just sold most of the farm for a solar farm, so that's a big transition for us as a family after 165 years there. You know, Dad's moving into town and all of that kind of stuff. We'll still have a little bit of land left, but that's a massive transition for our family and part of our identity and part of our my identity and our culture as a family, and so that's a huge transition for us, but a timely one and an exciting one in many ways. So I grew up on the farm and have been working with rural people in one form or another here and overseas for most of my working life. I'm really interested in how people and systems and organisations change, and got involved in working on resilience and developing the practice of resilience and applying the practice of resilience. And I say, you know, my heart really beats when I'm in a room or under a tree or in a shearing shed with rural people talking about rural issues, rural futures, rural challenges and rural opportunities. That's what I love and what sustains me and motivates me. I'm going to share my screen with a few slides here about the concept that we're talking about, and windows and back loops. I was tempted to call it budworms and back loops, and I'll explain what that means in a moment, but it really is, as I said, a tool for thinking about change and for thinking about where are we at and what's coming next and how might we respond. Before I do that though, now some people will have heard me speak before, and if you have, I don't want you to answer this question. Don't cheat here. This is for people that haven't seen this slide before. Can you just pop in the chat what you think is represented on this graph? What might this graph represent? Oops, sorry, I'll go back. So just what do you think this graph might represent? I can't see the chat here, Louise. So if there's anything that...
We've got sound waves, life, a time of changes, a heart rate, resilience, stress levels during change.
Yep.
Climate variability.
Yep, I've got it up now, sorry. Yep, there we go. Yep. Any pattern if variable. Yep. You can always be up and you can always be down. I'll come back to what it is in a moment, but it really relates strongly to what we're talking about and about cycles of change. I don't know about you, but I feel like at the moment life is like this. You're kind of hurtling down some sort of bloody river. Sometimes you feel like you're the guy at the back there. Like he sort of looks like he knows what he's doing. You know, looks like he's holding onto his paddle. He's got a tool there that he's using. He looks like he's sort of, you know, I'm pretty confident. But a lot of the time I feel like those people either at the front looking at each other or looking backwards and going, what the hell just happened, or what's going to happen, or where are we heading? Or sometimes I feel like the people in the middle there just hunkered down like with no idea and holding on for dear life. And it's pretty daunting. You think about what's happening in the world at the global scale. You think about, you know, the rise of populism. Look at what's happened and just happened in the US, and you look at what's happening in Europe and the UK and all sorts of places. And then you come down a scale and you come to the national level and some of the challenges that we face as a society and the rise in extremism, you know, the challenges around housing and homelessness and those sorts of things. And then you come down to your community level and you come down to the challenges that rural communities face and all of the challenges that they're facing various communities are facing right around the country. And as Louise said, some communities right now are facing, extreme challenges in terms of climate. Then you might come down to your family or to your project or to your business or whatever it might be. And at all of those levels, there's periods of turbulence. There's periods of white water. And sometimes you feel like you've got the paddle and you're the guy in the blue at the back there. And sometimes you feel like you're the other people in that boat. The key message here is you don't have a lot of control over the river. So you are on floating downstream, and because of all of those linkages from that national scale, international scale, national scale, right down to that local scale, we're often just being pummeled around by the white water. But we also know that sometimes it feels like this. Sometimes it's really smooth water and you're having a great time and you're paddling, everyone's happy and you're all paddling in the one direction, and you've either just come through some rough water and you're happy to be out the other side, or you actually don't know what's around the corner and you're paddling along naively thinking, isn't this great? Everything's going smoothly. This cycle, this process of change and the flow or the pattern of change helps us to understand a little bit about the river, a little bit about some of those periods of rough water and white water that we go through. And then it also helps us to understand about periods of stability and periods when the water's calm and when we're all paddling in the right direction. So this thing's called the adaptive cycle. There's lots, like I said, if you Google it, there's lots of versions of this online. I've put one in the chat, which we'll talk about later on. I think Louise emailed around another version that I sent her as well. There's no sort of hidden agenda in those different versions. They're just different versions that are out. I like this one for on screen. It visually looks really good. The other one that was sent around is just a handy one to print out, and it's got some other text with it as well. So if you're looking at either one of those, or it doesn't matter which one you're looking at, some of the language is slightly different, but the concept's the same. You have a period, this sort of period in the aqua there, the growth, the front loop, growth to maturity, or growth to conservation, it'll sometimes be called, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then you have this green bit, the back loop, the release phase, and the exploration or reorganisation phase, as it's sometimes called. This cycle has a really, like I said, it's got a really long history. So it actually came from ecology, and it came from a group of ecologists working in Canada. And they were working on this little thing called a budworm, and that's what I said before, that I was tempted to call it budworms and backloops. Pretty nondescript little grub, tiny little thing. The caterpillars eat the shoots of spruce and other pine trees. And in Canada, this is a massive pest in forestry. There was a period in the early 60s when this thing spread really rapidly on a really large scale. Oh, actually in the 40s and 50s, started to spread on a really big scale through a lot of the commercial forests in Canada. And the response at that time, the government had a lot of resources at hand. They had a lot of aeroplanes left over from the war, and they had a lot of pilots. So, and they also had a lot of chemicals, and there was a really large, industrial effort around the development of things like DDT. So relatively cheap chemicals, a method to deliver it, and people who needed a job. They started spraying, and they sprayed on it's an astronomical scale. Like I was actually chasing the figures. I can't remember the exact figures, but they were spraying millions of hectares a year using DDT to try and kill off this little grub. Not surprisingly, that had a huge disruptive effect on the ecosystems. And it wasn't just killing this grub, it was killing, if you're spraying DDT on that scale, it was killing all sorts of invertebrates, all sorts of things low in the food chain. It was bioaccumulating and having an impact right through the whole food web, right through the whole ecosystem. And rather than reduce the scale of the impact of this little grub, it actually increased. So through the late 40s into the 50s and into the 60s, the scale of the impact of this tiny grub on commercial forestry actually increased, despite the efforts to try and wipe it out with lots of pesticide. So a group of ecologists were asked to sort of understand what the hell's happening here. So they did a whole bunch of, typical ecological work. They looked at this little grub and they looked at, what eats it and what was being killed off by the sprays and all this kind of stuff, really just basic grassroots ecological stuff. And not surprisingly, they found that the spraying was interrupting the food web, but also by trying to eliminate fire out of the ecosystems, it was eliminating an important control mechanism that this little critter was being controlled by large-scale fires. And then on top of that, the forestry management practices. And so not surprisingly, they typical kind of ecological work, discovered a whole bunch of things, went to government and said, hey, this is what's causing it. And the response was not what they expected. So various governments didn't really respond, and there was a real clash between different parts of the agencies, as you can imagine, between the sort of wildlife and national parks management type stuff and the commercial aspects. There was clashes with the community, obviously, because they were suggesting that they stopped harvesting and they stopped controlling fires in different places, all sorts of stuff. Out of all of that emerged this idea of this cycle, and it basically started to get a clear picture of there's periods of stability and then periods of change. That thinking was then applied and taken elsewhere, and it was looked at in the Everglades. It was actually looked at here in our barrier reef system and a whole range of different systems all around the world where people are trying to manage complex systems. Out of all of that came this understanding that along with a whole range of other insights about the way systems change and about complex systems and the interaction between people and the environment, this cycle started to emerge. So I'll go through this kind of phases here, and I'll use an ecological example, but I'll come to some other examples that are social and economic. But basically, they identified that complex systems go through these phases. There's a phase when you start out and things are growing. So this is when, think about a seedling growing in a forest. So it's starting to, emerge. A seedling starts to emerge. Think about what it's doing. It puts out these leaves. It starts to collect, sunlight and water, and through photosynthesis, it starts to combine those into little structures. Over time, those structures get bigger and they get more stable. They get more rigid in their structure. They also are competing with other structures around them. They're competing with other things around them. So they're competing with other plant species, in this case, and other trees. And so there's a competition that causes things to grow, in certain ways and to grow rapidly to try and capture as many resources, in this case, capturing light and water. Big canopy, tall, trees shooting up, putting up big structures, putting down lots of roots. So they're investing a hell of a lot in the infrastructure that they need to grow. And they're doing it rapidly. So things are growing really rapidly. But over time, that growth starts to slow. And, this is a typical kind of old growth sort of forest system where you end up with a few really large, big structures. They're really successful. So you might look at that big tree and say, well, that's really successful. It's captured a lot of resources and it's organised them and it's built them into this big structure, and it continues by being really big and tall and having a big root system. It continues to have, to be successful. It's continuing to capture lots of resources. But you can see the challenge. A big tree like that can't pick up and move. A big tree like that is not very flexible. A big tree like that can't respond to change. So if the climate starts to change rapidly or the fire regime changes rapidly, that tree can't respond. So that's what we talk about, going from this growth phase into this maturity phase, when things start to become fairly rigid. And actually, we say when you get to the top of this curve, when you're into this maturity or conservation phase, and when I say conservation, I'm not talking about conservation as in national parks. I'm talking here about a conservative strategy or a maturity-based strategy, that you actually are quite vulnerable. So at the time when you're most successful, you're at the top of your game. You're also you're at the most vulnerable point here, because it's really hard to change strategy. It's really hard to change direction. You can't, if you're a big tree like that, you can't be anything else at this point. And the longer you stay there, the more fragile, the more brittle you become, the more vulnerable you become to some sort of disturbance. And we know in this context, the disturbance is, a bushfire. All of us that live in, the outside of the country, and particularly in the southeast and the southwest, and are well aware of, the destructive power of bushfires. And so you get this massive event that comes through, which can start very small. We know that, a big event can start from a single spark and it can spread really rapidly. And we know that there's a big release when that happens. And so when we talk here about the release, we're talking about the breakdown of a lot of those structures. We're talking about the release of things like nutrients, the release of creating space and light, and lots of nutrients become available. So out of that destruction, out of that release phase, or collapse phase, as it's sometimes called, you get this massive release. And you can already see that there's opportunities here. So as you get that release phase, as you get that breaking apart, you can see how opportunities can emerge. And when I get onto it later, this is where innovation can come in. This is where there's opportunities for new species to come in, for new ideas, new concepts, or whatever it might be, because things aren't fixed. The resources are not tied up. The resources are actually loose. They're free and available for other things to exploit and use and to develop. There is a tendency for the old structures to come back in here. So as you're moving into this phase where, yes, you've had a release, there is memory of the old system here. So tied up, under the bark of these trees, there's the epicormic shoots, the little shoots that can shoot out this green, these green shoots that'll fairly rapidly emerge to start to photosynthesize. Or there's memory in the soil through soil stored seed. So the seed bank that's built up in the soil. So we know that the old structures haven't gone away. They're still there, and they've got some memory that they'll bring back in, and they'll try to get back in there and reimpose their structure back on the system. But there are potential for lots of other things to happen. So there are potential for other opportunities here. So there might be some other species that might come in and dominate, and there might be weed species that come in that are specialists in that, when the soil's bare, there's a range of species. And if they're good at dispersing, if they've got, lots of seed that's dispersed, or it's wind dispersed or whatever, they'll quickly come back into that system. And you might end up with a slightly different looking forest. But pretty soon some structure will start to emerge again, and around we go in that loop. That's the basic idea here of this kind of loop. It doesn't always have to follow exactly that pattern, but there are these recognisable phases, and you can already start to see from a leadership perspective, from a change maker perspective, there's some different windows of opportunity that emerge here at different times, and I'll go into those in a little bit more detail. I want to come back to this. I don't know if there's been any more ideas have gone into the chat, but I can tell you this is the final ladder position of the Essendon Footy Club from the 1860s. Okay, so this is not whether they won the premiership or not. I'm a Victorian, so I'm AFL focused. Apologies for that. But this is not whether they won the premiership. This is just the position they finished on the ladder. Okay. The Essendon Footy Club is a pretty basic organisation that has one objective, and that is to win as many games over the season, or win more games over the season than other people, the other teams. That's it, a single objective. If you look at that pattern so this is over 160 years, it's never been able to hold itself at the top, but it's also never stayed at the bottom. But that makes no sense. If you think about that, a single organisation with a single objective should be able to organise itself, you would think, to hold itself near the top or maybe near the middle on average, or at least avoid being on the bottom, you know, very often. But if you look at this pattern, basically after every period of success, it ends up crashing to close to the bottom. There's a little period in the middle there where it's sort of hovered around the middle, but it's still bounced up and down a lot. It sort of makes no sense. Like, yes, there's other teams, they're competing against other teams, but you'd still think that over that period of time, there'd be a period of stability where a team could hold itself fairly constant. But the reality is it bounces around. That's because of this cycle. That's because built into this, the adaptive cycle, once you get to a point of success, once you get to the top of that curve, to the maturity curve, it's actually really hard to stay there. There's other competitors out there. There's other people looking at what you're doing and how you're doing it. There's people come in and start poaching your players. They poach your coach, all sorts of stuff. And pretty soon you go through a big collapse. And you go through, you know, we hear the footy coaches talking about it all the time, a rebuilding phase. That's that cycle. So there's these periods where, yes, you're on the way up, you reach some sort of level of maturity, but you can't stay there. You actually are really vulnerable when you're at the top of that cycle. So, and if we look at another example, so this comes from Kodak. So, you know, Kodak Camera Company, founded in 1880. So there was this emerging technology of photography and taking photos. Probably most of us in our families would have, you know, some early photos of those posed, you know, early Kodak moments. You know, everyone standing there with their top hats on and all that stuff, or their hats on, and women always seated and all that stuff. There was this period of emerging technology, and Kodak captured that whole idea of photographs are going to be an important part of our community, our society. People want to capture these moments. So company was founded. By 1967, it was one of the biggest companies in the world. And we sort of forget about this. Look at that, you know, 1967, think about $1 billion in sales in 1967. Like, that's a long time ago. This was an unbelievably successful organization that really understood people want to capture these moments, and it changed the language. You know, the Kodak moment, a lot of people here are probably too young to remember that, but I can still remember the Kodak moment. You know, their whole advertising was around cameras in the hands of, it wasn't a professional thing, it was mums and dads with cameras, and you capture your family moments. By 1976, 90% of the films, 85% of the cameras sold in the world came from Kodak. It's just unbelievable, absolute domination of a field. They invented in the 70s, they invented the first digital camera. So they knew that digitalization was coming, and they invested heavily in developing the technology. It weighed 7 kilos, apparently, that camera on the left there. They had, in 1988, they had 145,000 staff around the world. It was, you know, one of the biggest organizations that's ever existed. In 1997, their share price was $97 a share, which was up until Apple crossed the $100 mark, not, you know, a while ago. But this was the most valuable company on the planet. And they had a really clear strategy. We are a camera company. We develop cameras and the film to go in them. We are a camera company. We are about Kodak moments. So they were focused on, what do we do? What's our core business? We are about family moments. In 1999, the first camera phone's invented. So a whole bunch of companies out there, Nokia and others, Panasonic, recognised that once you could put a camera in a phone, that the world was going to change. It's hard to believe, but in a really short period of time, Kodak's shares were worth 54 cents. And I think it was by 2012, they filed for bankruptcy. The reality was that when they were at the top of their game, they had an opportunity to change strategy, but they actually didn't have the mindset to change strategy. They were trying. You know, I've read lots of different accounts. I've actually spoken to people who worked quite a senior level in Kodak, and they said they were aware of this. They knew this was happening, but in their DNA, they were a camera company. If you look at Panasonic, you look at Nokia, you look at Fuji, you look at all those other, they just make technology. They couldn't care less. They're not a camera company. They're not a bloody toaster company or whatever. They make technology. They make whatever consumers want. Highly flexible, no adherence to any identity. They just take whatever opportunities there are. If people are buying cameras, phones with cameras, we'll make phones with cameras. If people, buy, ironically, my kids are all going back to buying, you've probably all seen it, Happy Snap cameras. I've got teenage girls. They're all obsessed with Happy Snap cameras now and take the old, literally, the cameras we were using like before camera phones. There's a ton of them flooding onto the market again from a whole range of technology organisations. They don't care. They make whatever the consumers want. They're flexible. And when consumers stop wanting those things, they change strategy. That cycle, that process of building up expertise, building up your level of identity and your commitment, your structure, your investment in structure, your investment in the IP, your investment in your identity ultimately makes you more vulnerable over time. And it's a hard kind of notion to get across that at the peak of your game, you're at the most vulnerable. But if you think about sporting teams, you think about political parties, you think about big organisations like Kodak, you can see the trap. You can see the inflexibility. You become inflexible, you become brittle, you start looking inward, you start missing the innovation, you start missing the signs that you need to change until it's too late. And there is a point here somewhere between, that top of, maturing and release. There is a kind of little threshold there, a tipping point. And once you've gone past that tipping point, even if you've changed your strategy, the reality is it's too late. And you're going to go through some sort of collapse or some sort of release. As I said early on, I've worked with rural communities, and in rural communities for 25 years, and I see this pattern a lot. I see it at the farm scale. So this is a classic succession planning problem. So you see the farm where, dad's hung on for too long, and then the next generation come through and it's too late. The farm, the farm hasn't changed. There hasn't been enough shift in diversifying or whatever, and then it's really hard for the next generation. And often you'll see that next generation go through a big collapse. Or I've seen it in things like land care groups where people have just held on to that committee, refused to move on. Young people, the younger generation come through, they don't hang around, they see all these old people. And I'm dealing with a whole lot of land care groups now that I've dealt with for 20 years. It's the same people. And they're now desperately saying, oh, the group's about to collapse. And it's like, well, yeah, you've bloody killed it because you've hung on for 25 years and every young person's come along, you've scared them off, and etc. So you can see this pattern repeated again and again. And, the warning signs are there. The warning signs are there if you're open to looking around to what they are. In the Kodak case, they developed the technology, and yet they refused to actually understand what's the river we're floating in. What's happening to the context here? What can we read from what's happening around us about what we should do next? So I mentioned at the start about the idea of this cycle happening at multiple scales, and it's a really key idea here, and it's called panarchy. When you link these scales together, when you link these cycles together, across scales, it's called panarchy, which I don't like the word, but it basically means that, these cycles are actually linked. So this might be at the smaller scale, it might be a farm. At the local scale, you might be talking about a farm or a farm business. At the regional scale, you might be talking about the industry. At the global scale, you might be talking about that commodity at the national or global scale. And I won't go into too much detail here, but you can see the arrows there about revolt and remember. And the idea here is that if enough individual businesses or enough individual organisations or enough individual land care groups or whatever it is at that local scale are going over that tipping point, that of course is going to translate upwards. So think about, dairy farmers in the Murray-Darling Basin. If enough dairy farmers, we get a drought, we get commodity price collapse and we get water price increase, and you have, you know, X number of thousands of dairy farmers at a similar stage and starting to go over that tipping point, leaving the industry or being forced out of the industry, you can see how that translates upwards. You can see that that could then push the whole industry at a certain level over a threshold. But equally, going back the other way, you can see how the bigger, older structure, the slower, larger scale can then have an influence back the other way. And this idea of remember, and I mentioned in the forestry example or in the forest example, you know, the old structures are still there. So the old eucalypts have still got that epicormic growth, those buds sitting under the bark waiting, or the old ecosystem has embedded a whole lot of seeds in the soil stored bank, the seed bank, ready for the next opportunity. There's memory in the system. And just like there is human memory, you know, there's memory. There'll be people in Townsville at the moment who can say, oh, this is similar to, you know, 1968 and the water came from this way and it got to this level. That's remembering. That's remembering in a real human sense. But institutions and organisations and cultures remember, and they can impose that memory back down on the system and, you know, cause you to go back maybe through the same loop again. Oh, this is the way we've always done it. How many times have we heard that sitting around a committee room table? You know, we've always done it like this, or dad on the farm or whoever. So, oh no, we've always done it like this, or we've always done it at this time. They can impose that back in to the lower scales and force you to go through a similar kind of cycle again, if you like. Or they can impose memory that helps you to change. So there's a very famous example of this in the Christmas tsunamis. There's different fatality rates, and I've seen this firsthand myself in Bangladesh. Different fatality rates during disasters in different communities, and there's been a lot of work to understand the different fatality rates. And in the case of the Christmas tsunami in Banda Aceh, two villages side by side, exactly the same socio-economically, and yet lower fatality rates in one village versus the other one. When they dug into it, there was a story from a previous, you know, maybe going back a few thousand years, but there was a story where people remembered when the water goes out, as it does before a tsunami, when the water goes out, we run for the hills. So for that community, they had some memory that was imposed back when the collapse came. They had some memory that this is how we behave. In the other village, they didn't have that memory. When the water went out, they actually walked out onto the mud flats and out onto the reefs to pick up fish. They thought it was a gift from the gods. And obviously the tragedy that, you know, happens. Memory, that remembering, the system remembering and how it remembers is really important about what happens in the next time we go around through the loop after some sort of disaster. I've put this in the chat, and like I said, there's lots of versions of this around, but I actually really like this version for the language that it uses about these different phases. So you can see in that growth phase, it's talking about expansion, about development, about exploiting, about colonisation, about control. And some of that obviously refers to the way, you know, people and cultures move around the world and what's happened in our past. But it's also in terms of colonisation of ideas, in terms of control of, you know, trying to capture resources and control those. And that could be equally applied to a group, a community group that is trying to, you know, get access to resources and control the resources that it can, or whatever it might be. We move up into that maturity phase and we're talking about conservation, stabilisation, rigidity, fragility, efficiency. There's a real tendency towards becoming super efficient at the top there because you kind of know your game, you know what you don't need to do. And I'll often hear this. I work with a lot of boards and organisations, and people will be saying things like, we've just got to be super efficient. Let's just get on, do the job, don't waste any money. You know, let's not send our staff to conferences, that sort of stuff. We know what we need to do. That's a waste of money. Really focused on efficiency, really focused on just getting better and better and better and more efficient at what they do. And the reality is when you do that, you start cutting off innovation, you start cutting off opportunities, you start missing the messages about the camera phone and what it might mean. As we move around in that release phase, language like destruction, transformation, collapse, chaos, uncertainty. And obviously that's going to feel, for an individual or for someone that worked at Kodak for their whole life or whatever it might be, that phase is going to feel absolutely awful. You're going to feel, absolutely out of control. There's going to be a lot of loss, a lot of grief. There's going to be a lot of trauma associated with that sort of change. But out of that starts to emerge in that exploration phase or reorganisation phase, as it's sometimes called, there's going to be lots of opportunities. There's going to be new opportunities for new ideas. There's going to be renewal, reorganisation, restructuring, innovation, experimentation. And that can be really exciting and a really exciting place to be. All of those different phases have a different feel to them, and they have a different mindset when you're in them. And we're going to go into a breakout room soon. Emily's going to shoot us out into a breakout room. And I just want you in your little group to just pick one of these phases. So, you probably haven't got time to explore too many. I'd just pick one or two and talk about two things. There's two questions here, and I'll bring these up, I think. Hang on, will I? Yeah, I will. What might be the signs or signals to help recognise what phase you're in? So what are the things you'd be looking for? What are the emerging camera phone technologies that you need to have your eye out for? What are the signals or signs to help recognise what phase we're in? And then the really key question, what's the mindset or behaviour that you might need in that phase? So how might we need to think about things if we're in that phase? What are some of the mindsets and behaviours you'd want to practice yourself, or you'd want other people to practice with you to be able to get through that phase and move through to where you want to be in that, which is really in that kind of growth phase. That's the exciting bits where things are changing and expanding and new things are happening. How do we move through those other phases? What's the mindset that we need to move through those different phases? So they're the two questions. I might get can someone whack those in the chat? Is that okay, Louise? Or I'll leave them up while we do that. Just pop those in the chat so that they're there for you to use. And we'll have about 15 minutes or so in the breakout room. When you come back, it'd be just nice to hear some feedback about what did you talk about? What are some of the signs and signals that you thought were important to recognise what phase you're in? And then what are some of the mindsets and behaviours that you might need in that phase? Before we jump into has anyone got any questions, anything that they just want to clarify before we jump into the breakouts? No, we're all good. So we might go into the breakouts. Emily's going to do her stuff, and then we'll see you back on the other side. All right, there's all our beautiful participants. Few familiar faces, which is nice to see. I meant to mention that before. Yeah, g'day Matt and Steve, and I know Barb's there, but she's got a camera off, and a few others. So I'm interested, so I'm just going to open this up. I'm just interested in any observations that came out of your conversation, just anything that stood out for you about those two questions, any insights about maybe your own organisations or your own experience or anything that you that came out of the observations. Oh, there's Chloe too. G'day, Chloe. So yeah, anything, someone want to jump in? You can just come off mute and yell out if you like.
I can start if you like.
G'day, Penny.
How are you? Yeah, we had quite a general discussion, I guess, around the cycle and the mindsets and all that kind of thing. And I think there was a kind of general, and we did try to focus a little bit on maturity and release, thinking that they're probably quite difficult phases when you're in a boom and bust kind of cycle or whatever. But we had a little bit of discussion around how we feel sometimes Australia feels quite risk averse, and a lot of our innovation ends up going overseas for various reasons, just through that lack of stability. I think in finance and government support and all that kind of stuff. And it seemed to be across the sectors that were in our chat. But that being so risk averse kind of stops the innovation and the thought processes around change, which we felt were really important as far as moving through the cycle.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And when we think about, particularly when you talk about innovation in technology or something like that, or in ag, this is where those scales above, where I said, you know, we're linked to this, you know, global scale or regional scale or whatever. They'll just pick your ideas. Like that scale above is looking for innovation. They're looking, what can I exploit here? There's opportunists, you know, whether they're individuals or organisations or industries, are going to be looking at the scale below and going, hey, what can we pinch out of this and pull up to our scale and go on a growth phase themselves? And so, and if at your scale you're fairly risk averse, like you say, nationally we are a pretty risk averse sort of people and culture, that often we're going to miss those opportunities. Someone else is going to get that growth phase based on our innovation down here, but they've picked it up and taken it up to the next scale above. And meanwhile, we're still floundering. And I think the renewable stuff is the classic example. And I know that's your field, Penny, that, you know, that we're seeing a lot of the technology we develop here that disappears overseas because we're not taking that next step and not embedding that into our growth phase. So we're developing it. There's that in maybe the you know, the sort of back loop. We're coming up with lots of innovations and technologies, but we're maybe not maximising the benefit in those growth phases. Yep, nice one. Someone else want to go? Just something out of your conversation?
Matt actually contributed that one of the things that might be happening is mini versions of the infinity loop. Rather than one great big one, Kodak falls down, bang. It's actually lots and lots of little loops.
Yeah.
That happen, and eventually. Sorry, Matt, I have I'm acknowledging you. Should have let you give you, but it stuck with me.
Yeah, that's a good bit of pinching innovation there, Selena. No, you're exactly right. Like there's not, you know, and this thing's a metaphor. Like we need to be careful here. It's a model. So the real world, you know, does what the real world does. This is a model trying to explain it. But you're right, like every company, every organisation is going through its own little mini loops. I think one of the things that I mentioned before, but is this idea when you get a lot of things at the same stage, that's when you got the chance for, or the opportunity for, very significant large change to happen above that, because everyone's at the same stage. So if lots of organisations going through their own little loop are at the same stage, and that's what things like drought, policy, commodity price changes can do. It sets everyone to a really similar level in that loop, crunches everyone to a similar level, and then you're really vulnerable because, you know, you might have lots of people or organisations or industries or farm businesses all going over that tipping point at once. So that yes, they are all going through their own little loops and phases, and lots of different things influence that. But sometimes you've got this policy, price change, climate, you know, combining to actually sort of set everyone up to be at a similar stage, and then you are really vulnerable to some bigger thing coming along. So yeah, Matt, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, I was going to add to that. Look, sort of came up from how do businesses or organisations appear to stay at that growth maturity phase for so long?
Yeah.
What was in my mind that I didn't mention was, you know, I'm a rugby man, so All Blacks appear to have stayed in that growth maturity phase for so long. And I thought that organisations that do that are going through this release and growth process on various small things within their organisation. So they're letting go of this because it's not quite working, trying something new. And while they appear to be staying at that top level for so long, they're actually letting go and releasing things and growing again at a much smaller scale constantly.
Yep. I'll come to you, Steve, and then Renee in a sec. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Matt. So good organisations, good managers, good leaders recognise that, and they're prepared to make changes even when things are really going well and are stable. And that's probably, you know, one of the most difficult things to do, because people introduce a change when there's actually appears to be no reason to do it, but you're preparing for that next phase, and that takes real courage. And it takes commitment to it, because you might be making a hard decision to get rid of the bloody, best player who's the best player at the moment, but they're actually right at the end of their tether, and you're saying, sorry, you've got to go to create space for someone else, and that creates a new opportunity for someone else. But it's never easy, because you're letting go of something that's been part of the success growth phase, and people look at that and say, hey, this person or this part of the business was part of the growth and success. Why the hell are you chopping it off now? But if you look at some companies like Google, like Apple, the way they do it is to deliberately chop bits of their business off. They make them compete against themselves, all sorts of really interesting things to try to keep spinning around at the top of that growth phase and not go through the big release. And that's the challenge, because the big release phase is when you lose stuff. You start bleeding people and resources and goodwill and memory and all sorts of stuff. You lose those capitals when you go through that big release phase. And the challenge for a manager is to minimize the loss. Like, you want to be able to retain as much as you can so that you can come around again as quickly as you can and get on that growth phase. But often there's a big clean out of an organization or whatever, and a whole lot of people go at once, and that leaves you with often a lack of experience, a lack of knowledge, or whatever it might be. So there is a balance there of how do you spin yourself around without going through the big back loop. Steve, do you want to go, mate?
Oh, you've kind of covered it, because the model looks I've just lost the word that I needed now, but the model itself isn't symmetrical. The release phase, the time periods could be very different. Like the mature phase could be decades, and the release could be 6 months.
Yep.
And the good companies probably get it done really quick. And in our group, we've talked about failing fast.
Yeah. It's a really great point. There is different speeds in there, and yes, there's a little period of growth often at the start where things change quickly and people, it's a really rapid phase, but then that maturity phase, there is a slowing down, and really often, that can be decadal kind of change. And then suddenly, like, we talked about with groups, you might have the same committee for 15 years, and that's great. And then all of a sudden 6 people walk out the door and the organisation looks like it's going to fall over. And that can happen just, in the blink of an eye. And it's often related, people are making decisions related on what's happening around them. You get into a kind of a cascade of effects. It's like, oh, well, if they're leaving, I'm going to go too, if such and such leaves. And so you can see how committees or organisations can be really stable and then really quickly move into a phase where you lose a lot of capacity or whatever it might be. Thanks, Steve. Renee, do you want to go, mate?
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I guess we kind of chatted, well, kind of lifted it right up to our political system, and then had a really good talk about the Indi movement and how that kind of came about. But I work in regional development, so I work at the regional level, but I understand all the different loops and systems that are required. You've got to go through those different phases. And I was thinking about some of these kind of their existential policy issues or decisions that are made very remote. I'm in Western Australia, very remote to Western Australia in Canberra. And, things like the live sheep phase export, which, is going to impact our region quite severely, as well as, the renewable energy stuff, which is coming at us like a freight train. But it's interestingly, I'm in probably a very safe national state seat and a safe Liberal seat. And I don't hear either of those two groups really talking about this, but it's interesting that communities on the ground have just gone, well, stuff this. We see this as actually a massive opportunity for us, the renewable energy component.
Yeah.
And I think you guys you're seeing this over East, and I've definitely learned from some colleagues over East, that they're just getting their collective shit together themselves and going, well, this is what we want for our community. And they are doing the negotiation themselves without any kind of structural oversight from the state government.
Yeah.
And, you know, and Susan talked about the need to, you know, this is the big thing that's coming, but you need to collect yourselves together. You need to get your coalition of the willing. You need to build trust. You need to get information, build your network, have the vision. And it's a very, and to the point, we're also talking about this with housing. So the PM came over a couple of weeks ago and told the Wheatbelt we've got $33 million for housing, which everyone was really surprised at, but it has taken 2 years of work with 10 local governments to get that together. And it's not just a brain fart that the Prime Minister had, it's actually a very well thought out 2 years of work put in, a lot of engagement with the community to come up with a solution that was fairly compelling. You couldn't argue with it. So it's just, we didn't wait for the government to come to us. We just, and this is what the Wheatbelt does all the time. We rarely get looked at, despite being very stable, close to the city. We've got a big part to play in Perth's growth, all of this stuff. But it's fascinating to see the politics play out over here at the moment. And I think Lynn's on the call. She's in Geraldton. The Labor government released a Midwest Row and Central Wheatbelt plan, which is like an area half the size of Western Australia. And whereas, you know, Geraldton and Bunbury and Albany. And I think instead of getting caught up with this, oh, woe is me, you know, why can't we get this, and being a bunch of whingers, which we often are blamed for, our communities are kind of getting on the front foot. And I don't know how that works with this adaptive cycle, but I think it is that, you know, things are changing. We need to change with it. Here's the opportunity, and here we go. So, and we're on that loop now. And I think what will happen is, as things pick up, the momentum grows, and some of these things, hopefully, if they turn out, will be really great for our community. But it's but there's a letting go. You've got to let go. You've got to go. We've got to control what's in our control. This is the mindset thing, and see things as an opportunity, not a threat necessarily. So that's just my observations from what I've seen.
Thanks, Renee. There's a lot there to chew on, but one thing that just came to mind while you were speaking was, you know, how does stuff get done? Well, it gets done through networks of people with common purpose and shared purpose. And like you say, you know, the Prime Minister turns up and says, here's 30 million bucks for housing, and people go, oh, that's a brain fart. But actually, it's this network that's worked away in the background. And one of the things that, you know, I haven't talked about in this is actually being aware of the networks and what they're doing, and sometimes that's really good. And you know, if it aligns with your values and it's something really positive, and I can see Susan there. I didn't see you there before, Susan. So Susan and I are, you know, in Northeast Victoria, in the seat of Indi, and we know that it's the network, it's the relationship between people that's what's driven the independent movement here, and trust, and people who are really passionate about the process, and you know, the core values, all this kind of stuff. It's all about that network and the relationships. That aligns with my values, and that's really great. Sometimes they don't. And I've worked in a region where we went through a whole community planning process, and we brought some really radical ideas to the table, and a big proportion of the community were right on board. So this was a community facing some really major challenges. A bunch of the community were right on board. There was a whole bunch of people who didn't come to the community sessions, didn't participate. They turned up at the end and said, that's not going to happen. There was and we called it the shadow network, and we didn't understand the shadow network. There was a whole network of people who actually were behind the scenes, who were the power brokers really. And when it came to, okay, are we going to proceed with this funding bid and all this stuff, they just flattened it all. And so just being really aware of who are the networks and what are they doing and what aren't they doing. And we're all aware of the political networks sometimes, but there's also other networks about innovation. There are other networks around, you know, creating opportunities. And there's networks that want to block that stuff too, because whenever there's change involved, there's vested interests get impacted. So understanding what those vested interests are and how they might be impacted by various change. Anyone else, just quickly, I'm conscious of time, but I just want to say a couple of last things before we wrap up. But is there anyone else that wants to jump in, something from your conversation? Anything else you'd like to add?
No, but can I jump in, Paul? Sorry,
Yeah,
I'm just curious, and just when you're talking about you're going through the Affinity Loop and the organisation or the committee crashes, sometimes that's okay. Like, I think we've got this when we set committees up, that they don't have, we don't actually think about their lifespan.
yeah,
And they continue on beyond their scope and beyond their need, and everyone keeps continuing to try and keep that particular committee, that it's actually okay to let these go.
yeah.
And it's something I think is really cool to think about when you set up a committee and go, well, when is this lifespan and what are we trying to achieve, and really be clear about its purpose.
Yeah, and how do you know when's the right time to just say that's it? And there's a real tendency, we've set something up and people are invested in it and they just want to keep it going for its own sake. And I'm wrapped when I hear an organisation or a committee say, oh, we're going to fold, you know. It's like there's no energy, or there's no you know, there's no resources and no one can be bothered chasing and whatever. Well, great, that's it. The organisation's run its course, and just because it existed for a while doesn't mean it should exist in the future. And having some of those conversations early on can be really good to say, are we just here for this purpose, or are we setting up a new thing that we think is going to persist and do lots of things regardless of how things change in the future? And so, yeah, accepting that things have a shelf life, and sometimes it's really healthy if they die off. The other thing is, you know, knowing the time to transition, as we talked about before. You know, when should people let go? And that's a really difficult personal conversation, and people who have invested, the founder effect that you hear about, that sort of stuff. And that's really complex. People who start an organisation or are there on the ground floor are often the ones that want to keep it going. And that's, you know, that's tricky because you often can't evolve into the next thing while that original kind of cohort's still there. So I think both of those things are important to think about with organisations. The other, just quickly, the other thing about Louise and I were chatting while you're in the breakout room was just about how do you bring people along? How do you get people on the journey and to have these types of conversations? And one thing I would suggest is a really useful tool that complements this adaptive cycle is historical timelines. And I'm a big advocate for these. I do them all the time, is to look back, where have we come from? And people will start to recognise that the organisation or the community group or the industry or whatever has had periods of stability, periods of rapid change. So it's a non-threatening conversation. You can look back, you can discuss where have we been, why did that happen, you know, how did we survive through that period before you look forward. So that's a really nice, easy way into a conversation about, hey, we've gone through these natural cycles. You can see that from the past. Well, we're going to go through those again in the future. We're going to be crunched at some point in the future by things. What are we going to do to prepare for that? So I guess draw your awareness, that idea that looking back is a really useful starting point. And then you can have the conversation about the future. Often we blast into a room and try to have a conversation about the future. And people aren't ready for that. They're not really buying into the idea that there's cycles of change or whatever. Well, start by looking back and they can see it themselves. It's like, oh yeah, there was a period there where we're going really well. And then there was a period when this happened, then these people left and we went through this back loop or whatever. So that's just a useful thing to keep in mind. Just last couple of things just to wrap up. I'm really, you know, the world we live in is really messy and it's hard to see sometimes the patterns, but if you step back a little bit, pull back your focus a little bit, there are these discernible patterns and cycles of change and how things change over time. And so even in the messiness, And sometimes when you're kind of right in the white water and bouncing around, that it's hard to see. But if you can step back and look at the bigger picture and look back, like I just said, before you look forward, you can start to discern patterns and cycles of change, and that can help. It can help you feel better. It can help you feel more in control if you understand some of those cycles and where you might be at. That adaptive cycle, it just represents one pattern, but it's a pattern that's really common in social, economic, and ecological systems. And you know, there's a ton of literature on this thing now. It's been used by lots of researchers to explore things, and it's robust. It's a useful kind of tool. It's not deterministic. You know, it doesn't tell you the future. It's not a forecast tool. It's a tool or an idea that can just help to guide you some of your thinking, to help you ask questions, to reflect, etc. You know, don't use it to predict what's going to happen next. You're going to get surprised and get crunched. But use it to reflect and to have conversations and to prompt questions, etc. That's where it's most valuable. Becoming attuned to where are we at? What phase might we be in? And the good question is like, how does this feel? How does it feel right now? Like, and that will tell you sometimes where you're at. If it feels exciting and you feel like there's lots of opportunities and it's growing, you're probably in that growth phase. But if it feels like we don't know what to do, you know, we're not sure, we're losing people, it feels really bad, whatever, you're probably in that collapse phase, etc. Asking, how does it feel? And then what should we do? What should we do if we feel like that? What should we be trying to do, or how should we be trying to think? And then finally, you know, it's a simple thing to say, but it's really important, is a rigid mindset is not going to work in the world that we live in. So just being rigid, a fixed mindset, rigid behavior is inevitably going to crunch you up against the changing world. And if you're in that, raft, you know, and you're determined to go on a particular path, you're going to hit a rock or a snag or the bank, or be tipped out or go over a waterfall or whatever it might be. If you're prepared to be flexible, you're prepared to look at the broader context and be realistic about where I'm at and how might I need to prepare, and accepting the fact that change is inevitable, that sometimes we do go over tipping points, that things do need to change. And when they do, they might change really quickly. Even just doing that preparation is really valuable. Just doing the thought experiment, that's a valuable process to go through, and it will deliver new insights about where you're at right at the time. All right. I'm done. Unless anyone's got any other comments, questions, anything else that you want to add or explore, I'm happy to stay online for a few moments. I'm conscious we're just about out of time, but anything anyone wants to add, any questions, any comments, anything that's on your mind? And then I'll hand back to Louise to wrap us up. All good?
All good.
Yep, fresh eyes, comment there about fresh eyes. Fresh eyes from outside is really useful. That's a great comment, actually, getting someone else to come and have a look. And they can often see what you can't see. It's a really nice way to finish. All right. Thanks, folks. I'll hand back to Louise. Thanks, Louise.
Well, Paul, as I said, you're not that rusty after all, after a holiday. And I don't know about you. As I said, I just thank you so much on behalf of ARLF and also the participants in the group for sharing such a powerful model. I absolutely love the analogies, and I think that's part of the fresh perspectives. Those sorts of analogies can actually help you sit up over above and have a new, fresh look down. I personally, when I first saw Paul do this model in Finley, I think with Steve down there, I actually was standing behind the scenes with tears rolling down my eyes for no other reason. I said I'd just spent the last 11 years working in a community organisation in a not-for-profit suicide prevention space. It was so tough because I was trying to keep it going. It was a 20-year organisation, and I didn't want it on my shoulders for it to fall apart. So whereas, in fact, Paul's model really helped me look at it and go, I should have let it go, and something new would have actually come through and actually replaced it. So, and it's had such a powerful impact on in many of the other workshops as well. So So thank you so much, Paul. I know this has been particularly useful as well. So we really, really appreciate your time and the effort put together with the presentation. And you will see he's about to launch into his Changemaker workshops for 2025. We're rolling out over 60, I think, in the next 5 months. So it's going to be rather hectic. So thank you once again for all coming along. Just a quick, the next workshop will be Tanya Stevenson, and I really recommend coming along. She's now my community organisation god. And she's going to talk us through a model of how she actually implements change and creates new opportunities for her community organisation. Just working on the date, so keep an eye out for that one. And also on Thursday, our wonderful Selena Ham is actually facilitating our next community cafe. So it's happening on Thursday, the 6th of February at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I'd like to encourage you to all come along. So come as you are. This is just about connecting with others who are doing like-minded things in across the network as well. So it's just an opportunity to connect, think outside the square, and it'll be just, again, just like a community, a normal cafe, just bring a cup of coffee and share what you're up to. So we'll look forward to hopefully seeing you then.
Louise, how do we join those? Is there a link on the Drought Ready Hub Facebook page?
Yes, it's in the event. So just on the community, if you press on the community cafes, you'll see the link in there. But we'll repost another advertisement.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Brilliant, and thank you so much to everybody, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you.